In this next lecture, we will continue our discussion of monopolies. Specifically, we're going to compare monopoly outcomes to the competitive market. We're going to see that in monopoly markets, monopolists charge a higher price and sell a lower quantity than in a competitive market. This creates deadweight loss. And this will be the same concept of deadweight loss that we talked about in previous lectures. Lastly, we'll talk about some solutions that governments use to curtail monopolies. Some solutions in some situations work better than others. So this table provides a very helpful and concise comparison about monopolies and competitive markets and what we talked about last lecture. So just to review, monopolist is one firm compared to many firms under competitive markets. Competitive markets produce an efficient level of output where price is equal to marginal cost. So that means under competitive markets, there is no deadweight loss. We will see in a little bit that monopolies produce less than the efficient level of output, and that leads to deadweight loss. In competitive markets, there are no profits in the long run. If firms are earning profits in the short run, then new firms will enter. That will drive the price down until it reaches the place where marginal cost equals the minimum possible average total cost. So that extinguishes long-run profits. Since there are barriers to entry, no other firms can enter a market if a monopolist is earning profits, so monopolists may earn long-run economic profits. Okay, so just to review what a monopolist's decision would look like graphically. Here's our setup. Our monopolist has a demand curve, and that demand curve will give us a marginal revenue curve. Remember that the marginal revenue curve shows us the change in revenue for a change in quantity sold. So our monopolist has a marginal cost curve and an average total cost curve. So what is our monopolist going to do in this situation? Well, our monopolist is going to sell at a quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. The price the monopolist is going to charge is going to be the price given by the demand curve at that quantity. So again, trace that quantity up to the demand curve and then over. That is the price the monopolist will charge. The monopolist's costs for selling that quantity is given by the average total cost curve at that quantity. And then the profit or the loss is the difference between price and average total cost times the quantity. So why do we care about monopolies in an economic sense? Well, we care about monopolies because they generate deadweight loss. So what happens is monopolies sell a lower quantity than compared to competitive markets. And they charge a higher price. And this is going to create deadweight loss. This is referred to as market failure. Remember, we talked about market failure earlier when we discussed externalities and public goods, common resources. Monopolies can also generate less choices for consumers. So generally, we like choice. We like to be able to choose different kinds of products. Doesn't happen with a monopoly. And monopolies can lead to unhealthy competition, which is called rent seeking. So how can we compare competitive markets to monopolies? Let's just put them side by side. So here we have supply and demand curve for a firm, and this is a competitive industry. So competitive industry is going to reach a price and a quantity where the supply and demand curves cross, and that is an efficient market. So if we looked at a monopolist setup, here's our demand curve, our marginal revenue curve, and marginal cost. If this were a competitive market, the firm would produce here, the place where marginal cost crosses the demand curve. Now, if you remember from a few slides earlier, this is not where a monopolist produces. A monopolist chooses a quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So that's here. Why does this happen? Well, remember that in a competitive market, the firm faces a horizontal demand curve. So there is really no marginal revenue curve. So you could think about if this were an individual firm in competitive market, really they would see a demand curve horizontally along this line, so then they would produce here. Monopolists do have the ability to change the prices that they charge, so they have a marginal revenue curve, so they produce a different quantity. Okay, so you can see that the quantity that the monopolist is going to sell is lower than the quantity in perfect competition. The price that the monopolist charges is higher than the price in perfect competition. So this is going to generate deadweight loss. And to see where the deadweight loss is, we're going to simplify our diagram a little bit and just have an upward sloping marginal cost curve. This is just going to make the deadweight loss easier to see. So again, this is our quantity and price that would have happened under perfect competition. This is our quantity and price that happens under the monopolist. So the first thing that happens is under monopoly, we have an area of consumer surplus that is transferred to producer surplus under monopoly. So this shaded rectangle here would have been consumer surplus under perfect competition. It's transferred to the monopolist under the monopoly. Now, in economics, we don't necessarily care about this. We care about the total amount of efficiency. That's what we care about. So this isn't necessarily the big problem. The big problem is that we have a triangle of deadweight loss. Notice that at this quantity here, these trades that would have happened would have increased overall efficiency. So this person here would have been willing to pay a much higher rate than the marginal cost, and so on and so forth, all the way up to here. So this triangle here is deadweight loss. So the reason that these trades don't happen under monopoly is that the monopolist doesn't care about overall efficiency. The monopolist cares about their profits. So they're going to maximize their profits, not maximize overall efficiency. So just to summarize, monopoly quantity is less than quantity under perfect competition. Monopoly price is greater than the price under perfect competition. And deadweight loss happens under monopoly, does not happen under perfect competition. Monopolies can also lead to other problems. So under a monopolist, you only have one choice. So you can think about this in terms of all of those TV channels that you purchase along with the few TV channels that you actually watch. So I don't know what's on MTV2. Back in my day, there was no MTV2, and there was MTV and VH1, and they both showed music videos and Beavis and Butthead episodes. But now, a whole lot of TV channels, and restricts your choice since there are only a handful of providers, cable providers, that you can choose from. Monopolies also lead to something called rent-seeking. And rent-seeking is a situation where companies expend resources not to trying to make a better product or a product at a lower price, but trying to establish market power and monopoly power. So a lot of times you will see this with lobbying. Companies will pay lobbyists to try and get laws passed that restrict competition. And this is inefficient. So we don't like resources being used to try and establish monopoly power. We want them used to trying to produce better products that consumers would enjoy. All right, so we have these problems with monopolies, main one being deadweight loss. So how might the government try and solve these problems? Well, the first thing that the government might try and do is break up the monopolists. So in 1982, the government broke up AT&T. The classic example is the government breaking up Standard Oil in the early 1900s. So you break up one large company into smaller companies, and then you no longer have a monopoly. If you have a domestic company that is a monopolist, well, you can try and reduce trade barriers. You can allow international trade, or you can even try and help trade across state borders. So another very common solution is price regulation, and this happens with natural monopolies. So natural monopolies are your utilities. So utilities often have their prices regulated. We don't want to break up utilities because that would lead to higher costs. Natural monopolies are generated because of returns to scale, so monopolies are the cheapest way to produce these goods. So how might we want to regulate natural monopolies? So here's our natural monopolies demand and marginal revenue curve. And a natural monopoly, again, is given by a decreasing average total cost curve. So note that this average total cost curve is not U-shaped, it's always decreasing. So where is our natural monopoly going to produce? Well, it's going to produce when marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. It's here. What price will it charge? Trace that up to the demand curve and over. That's the price. What will this natural monopolist's profits be? Well, it's the difference between the price and the average total cost curve at this quantity. So here's our natural monopoly profit. If this was a perfectly competitive market, then note that the quantity that's produced would be way out here where marginal cost crosses the demand curve. So we might want to say, okay, monopolist, you have to act like this was a perfectly competitive market. You have to charge your price equal to the marginal cost, and you have to sell this quantity. Well, what's going to happen then? Well, note that at this quantity, here's the price that the monopolist is going to charge. Here's the average total cost curve, which is higher than that. So that means that if we regulate the monopolist in this way, the monopolist is going to lose economic profits. So they're going to make an economic loss, and they're going to go out of business. So obviously we need to think of something else to do in this situation. Well, one thing we could do is give subsidies to the firm. Maybe give a subsidy equal to the difference between the price and the average total cost. The other thing we could do is set price equal to average total cost at that quantity that we wanted. The other thing we could do is just nationalize that firm, have the government own it. So other problems that can arise with price setting is when you set prices and you set them too low, governments can eliminate the motive that profits give firms to innovate and try and make better profits at a cheaper price. So also if we nationalize the firm, you could think that government employees and government firms may not be as efficient. So there's no profit motive to try and excel, so government firms can kind of be bloated. Okay, so in conclusion, economists really like competitive markets. competitive markets operate with no deadweight loss. They are welfare enhancing for both consumers and firms, and monopolies are not nearly as good. Why? Well, we have a single seller, and that single seller operates in some situation where there are high barriers to entry, and that prevents other firms from entering. So that means that when we have this single firm is a price maker. So it gets to choose prices that it charges. So monopolist still sets its price and still sets its quantity according to the same rules. Marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. That gives you the quantity, but that rule leads to a lower output and a higher price than if the market had been perfectly competitive. That leads to deadweight loss. So governments can try and fix monopoly problems. They can try and break up firms, they can reduce trade barriers, and they can regulate prices, or they can assume control of natural monopolies. But there are costs and benefits to each of these solutions, and sometimes it may be best to just leave the monopolist alone.